I guess I finally made it to Turf Talk. So the video where this person left this comment has been shared multiple times by TERFs, so that means that now I'm getting harassed by people whose understanding of womanhood doesn't go past their genitals. And that's not fun. And if you're not particularly fond of TERFs, I would really appreciate if you can interact with that video so that it can make its way back to the people with brains side of TikTok. But let's just break down why the autogynephilia thing is just sexist and puritanical bullshit that TERFs try to pass off as science. Because this entire theory is predicated on the idea that trans women enjoying sex from the standpoint of the body that aligns with their gender identities is somehow bad. Like, yeah, I like having sex as a woman because I am a woman. But to these people, women enjoying their own bodies is something that they just cannot comprehend. Wow, such feminism. You call yourself radical, but you try to reinforce this narrow and patriarchal understanding of sexuality. You guys are just conservatives with an identity crisis.
The trans rights movement worked as a quasi-religion wherein the idea of a soul is used to support the idea that one can be the wrong sex. In other words, a gendered soul which is not aligned with one's body or reality. As a result, gender dysphoria occurs, which is a mental illness which is to be treated with sexist reassignment surgery and social transition. Or at least, in the past, it was seen as such. Now, one has to do little more than declare themselves trans to be treated as such. Teenagers with comorbidities are prescribed hormones on their first visit without any treatment for other conditions or mental health checks. Laws have been passed to allow anyone for any reason to declare themselves of the opposite sex and leaves little recourse for those who choose to use the broadness of these laws for their own ends. Due to a public perception of transgenderism being one of the most oppressed minorities, it has become impossible to critique the harm this group has caused to the gay rights and women's liberation movements. This is despite the large number of white men involved in the movement, as well as the obvious money trails which illustrate why the medical community retains a vested interest in suppressing honest and detrimental reports on the cause. One such example can be seen in the research of Blanchard regarding autogynephilia. Autogynephilia refers to the paraphilia where one is aroused with the thought of themselves as a woman. This idea was not given name until Blanchard's paper in autogynephilia, but prior to had still been recognized by physicians as a paraphilia. The first example can be seen in Magnus Hirschfeld's work, which also coined the term transsexualism in 1910. He identified the erotic idea of being a woman in a subgroup of cross-dressing males. We are almost tempted to believe that we are here faced with a splitting of the personality in the sense that the masculine component in the psyche of these men is sexually stimulated by the feminine component and that they feel attracted not by the women outside them, but by the women inside them. Havelock Ellis, another early sexologist, called this behavior eonism, usually in regard to non-homosexual males to designate overt cross-gender behavior as well as subjective feelings. He sometimes used an alternative term, sexo-aesthetic inversion, for the same thing. In his view, the eonist is embodying in an extreme degree the aesthetic tribute of limitation of and identification with the admired object. It is normal for a man to identify himself with the woman he loves. The eonist carries that identification too far. In other writings, Ellis reiterated his opinion that eonism and normal heterosexual interest have some common point of origin. Psychologically speaking, it seems to me that we must regard sexo-aesthetic inversion as really a modification of normal heterosexuality. Blanchard's typology further elaborates on and provides a name to this concept. His work suggests that trans-identified males fall into two categories: homosexual males and autogynephiles.
One time before coming out during activities, a girl accidentally called me a girl, and I immediately finished. And she asked me why it happened right then, and all I could say was,
This was elaborated on throughout his research career, as well as in the book of his colleague Anne Lawrence, Men Trapped in Men's Bodies. Lawrence denounces the idea of the description, women trapped in men's bodies, regardless of how widely it is used within the community, but points out that one type of MTF transsexuals better fits this description than the other. She is referring to those who are exclusively male-attracted, who often have a lifetime history of female typical interests, behaviors, and personality characteristics, and, most importantly, do not have sexual arousal associated with their cross-dressing. This male-to-female type is often referred to as homosexual male-to-female transsexuals. Autogynephiles, in contrast, intensely desire to be female, but display few of the interests, behaviors, and psychological traits that are typical of women, and instead tend to be male-typical. Nearly all were cross-dressing secretly by puberty, which was associated with intense sexual arousal, but they retain masculine interest and male-typical jobs like engineering, computer programming, or military service. These transsexuals tend to be exclusively female-attracted, though they might fantasize about having sex with men, but only when they also fantasize about themselves as women. They also continue to be erotically aroused by cross-dressing and by the fantasy of being female, something traditionally associated with transvestic fetishism, not transsexualism. The concept of being trapped in the wrong body is rhetoric meant to make non-homosexual transsexuality easier to understand and more legitimized. For example, homosexual male-to-female transsexualism, or extremely feminine men who are attracted to other men and dress as women, have been observed in essentially all cultures and in places, may be so prevalent that socially sanctioned roles have been created to accommodate them. In other words, there is a congruence of sexual orientation, appearance, and temperament in feminine gay men dressing as women. The concept of a non-homosexual male-to-female transsexual is not so obvious. After all, why would an apparently masculine man who is attracted to women want to make his body resemble a woman's body and live as a woman? The metaphor of being trapped in the wrong body then suggests the pain and confusion they may feel, but is overwhelmingly a misleading metaphor, as it implies the presence of female-typical attitudes and behavior which are rarely present in non-homosexual transsexuals, and amidst the intense, perplexing, shame-inducing erotic arousal that seems to simultaneously animate and discredit their desires to have female bodies. Blanchard describes autogynephilia as being a sexual orientation, in other words, innate and immutable. Others view it as a paraphilia, as many who previously did not have autogynephilic fantasies may have picked up such tendencies from porn use, which has become more varied and more intense throughout the years. Porn itself is shown to warp sexual response, often making it impossible for addicts to orgasm with another person, as well as requiring more and more extreme pornography in order to achieve the same effect. Although studies on pornography are no longer common due to the danger illustrated in showing porn to participants, this aspect of autogynephilia cannot be ignored. Autogynephilia does not have a place within the concept of transgenderism as presented by trans rights activists, wherein transitioning is righting a wrong and placing an inherently gendered soul into the correct body. It implies that a sexual connection to trans women, which blatantly contradicts the experience of womanhood that many women have. It implies that trans women are men with a mental disorder instead of women in men's bodies. Furthermore, it points at the danger of playing along with the delusion of being able to change one's sex and the folly of claiming to understand the lived experience of the opposite sex. Julia Serrano, author of Whipping Girl and Trans Rights Activist, attempts to refute the theory of autogynephilia by claiming that women also get female/feminine embodiment fantasies, therefore making the men who have them unremarkable and further proving their womanhood. Serrano states, "Perhaps no evidence undermines autogynephilia theory more than recent studies that have shown that FEFs are quite common in cisgender women, and that cross-sex/gender embodiment fantasies also occur among the greater cisgender population. For example, Veal et al., the first autogynephilia-related study to use a control group, which Blanchard never bothered to do, found that 52% of their cisgender female subjects experienced FEFs at levels comparable to trans women that Blanchard classified as autogynephiles. The concept that women are just as likely to have autogynephilia, or arousal at their state of being a woman, is blatantly ludicrous to any woman. Recent criticism of the cited study points out the flaws in their methodology. The abstract reads, "Furthermore, based on evidence collected from natal males of gender dysphoria, Blanchard argued that autogynephilia is the fundamental motivation among non-homosexual males who pursue sex reassignment surgery or live as a transgender woman." These ideas have been challenged by several writers who have asserted or offered evidence that autogynephilia is common among women. However, their evidence was weakened by problematic measures and limited comparison groups. We compared 4 samples of autogynephilic natal males, 4 samples of non-autogynephilic natal males, and 2 samples of natal females using Blanchard's original measure, the core autogynephilia scale. The autogynephilic samples had much higher mean scores compared with non-autogynephilic natal males and natal females who were similar. Our findings refute the contention that autogynephilia is common among natal females. In other words, no. Women are not sexually attracted to themselves because they are women, using the same skill that Blanchard did in his original reports. Veal's measures of sexual orientation and autogynephilia were not well constructed, which probably interfered with the accurate identification of participants' sexual orientations and artificially lowered estimates of their autogynephilic arousal. In her analysis, Veal used several measures that were unrelated to the defining features of Blanchard's typology. This rendered her analysis invalid as a confirmation or disconfirmation of Blanchard's typology. Whatever typology Veal was examining, it was not Blanchard's typology. Even if Veal had used measures that reflected Blanchard's typology, her sample size was too small and only covered one of the 2 MTF transsexual types, non-homosexuals. An important limitation of Veal's 2014 analysis, not its most significant shortcoming but one nonetheless worth noting, derives from its use of poorly constructed measures of sexual orientation and autogynephilia. This is a limitation that Veal herself acknowledged. Other criticisms Serrano provides are as follows. 1. The theory is too rigid. 2. Sexologists like Blanchard do not always take the word of trans women at face value. 3. As stated by Serrano, it needlessly sexualizes us. This criticism attempts to center the emotional response and acceptance of trans women over factual reporting. Regardless of personal experience, if theory and research illustrates that a large group of people can be sorted into two groups, then individualistic identification doesn't matter, in the same way that regardless of personal opinion, there are two sexes and only two genders. People may argue that sex is a spectrum, but factual reporting in science illustrates otherwise. Serrano's second argument, that sexologists do not take the word of trans women at face value, is also an invalid criticism. We do not treat the delusions of schizophrenic patients as factual reports of reality. We know that the voices, hallucinations, delusions of grandeur, and other symptoms, while real to them and a cause of distress, are not accurate depictions of the world around them. To take a mentally ill person at face value is to ignore that they face a mental illness, and gender dysphoria, discomfort with one's body due to the sex they are and the gendered expectations placed upon it, is a mental illness. To ignore this does not abide by scientific or medical principles, namely, to report objectively and to do no harm. The theory may be too rigid or not account for all self-reported accounts at face value, but we must also take into account that self-reporting is not always reliable, particularly when it reveals aspects of oneself that they may not wish to confront. Many transsexuals have a self-favorable or socially desirable response style, which has been strongly correlated with a tendency to describe oneself as a classic or textbook example of male-to-female transsexualism, with further accounts for those of the non-homosexual male-to-female category who deny autogynephilic arousal. Additionally, further research by Blanchard, wherein changes in penile blood volume were measured when listening to audio tape recordings of cross-dressing, sex as a female with a male, sex as a male with a female, and solitary non-sexual activity, had a strong penile response to the cross-dressing fantasy, which illustrates that many or most non-homosexual cross-dressing men who deny sexual arousal in association with cross-dressing are not reporting accurately. Some self-identified homosexual transsexuals who are aroused by autogynephilic fantasies may be caused by the fantasy itself, leading men to believe that their sexual orientation had changed, inaccurately reporting themselves as homosexual when they still are heterosexual. Much of Serrano's criticism is easily debunked or in regards to personal opinion over objective reporting. It is important to note that the author of this critique, Julius Serrano, is a trans woman, and therefore his critique must be considered as a form of defense as what he considers to be a personal attack against his identity. This is also an author who writes, "While I never really believed the cliché about women being good for only one thing, that sentiment kept creeping into my fantasies. It's called forced feminization, transforming the loss of male privilege into the best fuck ever." Despite the constant back and forth and claims of refutation, Blanchard's theories seem far more plausible and supported than those of his opposition, whose claims have often been disproven or built on erroneously founded research. Of course, Blanchard himself admits that his theories are just that, theories. Theories which require further research to be proven true, false, or something in between. However, in context of the trans rights movement and the observed behavior of trans women therein, I find these more compelling explanations for male transsexualism than the idea that we truly have gendered souls which can be placed in the wrong bodies. After all, gender itself is a construct which is applied unfairly to ascribe behaviors and roles onto the two sexes. It is important to note that regardless of how innate autogynephilia is, we must keep in context the implications of the sexual aspect of the experience when trying to accommodate trans-identified males. The Gene study found that male-to-female transsexuals retained a male pattern regarding criminality. The same was true regarding violent crime. The study provides strong evidence that policymakers cannot safely assume A. That trans women's offending patterns, including violent offending, will be significantly different than those of the general male population, or B. That they will be similar to those of the general female population. In fact, the Ministry of Justice 2020 data regarding figures for sex offending rates for men, women, and trans women over the same period revealed 76 sex offenders out of 129 trans women, or 58.9% of incarcerated trans women are there for sex offenses, in contrast to 125 sex offenders out of 3,812 women in prison, or 3.3%, and 13,234 sex offenders out of 78,781 men in prison, or 16.8%. In other words, trans women are more likely to be incarcerated for sexual offenses, and to ignore the link between autogynephilia and trans women is to ignore the danger of allowing them access to sex-segregated spaces, particularly as many retain attraction to females. Single-sex spaces are essential to maintaining the safety and rights of women, and when the common argument is that trans women are women, it allows those who would wish to harm women to have easy access, which others are unable to criticize for fear of being called transphobic. This, dear viewers, is where we part. I've had an awful cough all day, so I apologize if I sound a bit off. This is a topic that I don't know, it really interested me. I started reading Men Trapped in Men's Bodies for fun, and then I was like, oh, I want to write about this. So this happened to come out a bit out of order, in that I wasn't planning on writing this right now. But I think it's an interesting theory, and I think it's really interesting also because someone in my comment section tried to argue that Julia Serrano's debunking of autogynephilia was a valid debunking, which I personally hadn't read it at the time, but I knew that that was unlikely. So I read through it, and it's linking to all of these studies that have since been disproven, and all in all has a very defensive tone to it, which to me just reads as someone taking that, being told that autogynephilia is real and taking that personally because they don't like it. And I think that's one of the reasons why people fight back against it so much, because nowhere in Blanchard's work does he say, oh, these are awful, horrible people. He says we need to study this more so we can accurately help them. And it's the same kind of rhetoric you hear when, discussing radical feminism regarding trans rights. I'm not saying that I hate you and that I want you to go die in a hole. What I'm saying is that women are adult human females and that sex is a real thing that can't be changed. Nothing in those statements is hateful or hurtful. You just don't like what it implies because it doesn't prove your personal fantasy. Anyhow, if you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, please leave them down below. Feel free to leave any suggestions for more videos. And please feel free to join the membership thing or the Discord channel. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.